Good afternoon, it's 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and start the webinar. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I am very happy to be able to host for you this afternoon a webinar on the OMUTCD hot topics. We are going to have 2 Ohio-based presenters and 2 national presenters on this topic, but I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items before we start. If you haven't done so already, we do ask you to please go ahead and respond to the poll that's on the screen. Let us know what type of agency you represent. We feel this will be very helpful as we move through the webinar for the presenters. Also, you'll notice on your screen that there's a chat pod on the bottom left-hand side. If you don't already see the chat pod, how you open that up is by looking on the bottom left-hand corner. There's going to be a circle with a thought bubble in it. Click on that, and then you should see the conversation panel appear. That is the area where we would ask you please enter questions while the presenters are working through the webinar information. We are going to open the phone lines at the end of the webinar for audio questions. Currently, everybody is already muted as they join the webinar, just to cut down on background noise. So with that, the only other thing I will mention is that I am attempting to record this webinar so we can make it available in the future to individuals who would like to be able to watch it. Of course, they won't have the benefit of having the interaction that you're going to have since you're here live, and we do appreciate you being here. So with that, I believe Ron and Tria, you're going to go first. So I'll go ahead and turn things over to you guys. They're our Ohio-based Federal Highway Division partners. Are you ready?
Yep, we're ready.
Great.
Thanks, Victoria. I do want to extend a thank you to Victoria for supporting us and setting this up. My name is Tria Sakala. I'm the ITS Traffic Operations Engineer here for Federal Highway in the Ohio Division Office. And with me, I have Ron Garcheski. He's our Safety Engineer. My role, I am primary for MUTCD related items here in Ohio, and Ron is support for MUTCD related items, although he's primary for Part 6 items. The reason we're here today is we do know that there are a lot of questions regarding the few topics that we're going to talk about today. That includes crosswalks. We do know that a lot of local agencies are interested in various crosswalk applications. We just wanted to make sure that we had an open forum where we can communicate to our partners what is allowable for crosswalks and what your options are for aesthetic treatments. And then also today we're going to talk about experiments as they relate to the MUTCD. And Ron will talk about Ron and Kevin will talk about the hard compliance dates for the horizontal curves. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Ron. I just wanted to touch base about our role with the MUTCD here in the at the division. So we review and approve the state MUTCD. Ohio does have its own version of the national MUTCD, and we perform that review and approval after a new MUTCD has been issued. We also provide information on MUTCD revisions and interim approvals and other federal actions related to the MUTCD. We also assist ODOT and local agencies with the interpretations of the manual. And we also make sure that we consult with the MUTCD team in our DC office for anything that's not entirely clear. And we also notify ODOT and local agencies if there are any noteworthy non-compliance issues observed or reported to us. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ron.
Thank you, Tria. This is Ron Garcheski. As Tria mentioned, I'm the safety engineer here in our Ohio Division office. I just wanted to share a few thoughts on how the MUTCD interacts with safety out on our roadways, and in particular pedestrian safety, which is one of the topics today with the crosswalks. So both nationally and here in Ohio, we have seen a consistent trend of increasing pedestrian fatalities on our system. And actually, if you look at the national numbers over the last 10 years, every category of road user has either had the same or fewer traffic fatalities during that span except one, and that's pedestrians and bicyclists. Passenger cars, SUVs, large trucks, motorcycles, all either saw the same number of fatalities or less, but pedestrians and bicyclists saw an increase. In fact, you may have seen recent headlines there's some articles out there that nationally, I think we're seeing the highest level of pedestrian fatalities since 1990. So with these recent trends, there's definitely an increased emphasis being placed on pedestrian and bicycle safety, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar today. And it's why crosswalks and decorative crosswalk treatments and really all traffic control devices are so important. We really want them to be as simple as possible for the road user, and we don't want them to be misinterpreted or be a distraction for anyone just trying to navigate our system. Because that's really the whole point of the manual, is to help people move through our system safely and efficiently. So I just wanted to share a little context for what you're going to hear today, and I think I'll turn it back over to Tria now.
Actually,
Okay,
Ron,
well,
this is Victoria. I'm going to jump in real quick because we had a couple questions in the chat pod kind of related to how the webinar is running, and I just wanted to let everybody know that right now all we currently have up is the first poll question about what agency you represent. So don't get concerned if you haven't seen any slides yet. We do have a few more poll questions we're going to move through before we actually get into the slide presentation. And if you're having audio issues through your computer, I mentioned in the chat pod that there's always the phone line. You can always call in separately besides seeing the computer presentation and listen to the audio that way. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
oh, not a problem. Victoria, I think we can start pulling a few of the other poll questions before I introduce David and Kevin, if that's okay. All right. So if everyone could go ahead and, thank you. And I think, okay.
Give that a few more seconds.
Yep.
For those of you who are under the other or multiple, if you want to tell us what your other is, if it's not one of the ones that are listed, go ahead and put it in the chat pod.
Okay, and then Victoria was the next one with the crosswalks. We can do that one right before Dave starts his presentation.
Do you want the third one though about the manual?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll put that one up now. So last chance here while I'm putting the question up to answer the one that was up about the disciplines.
Okay. Great. And if everyone could fill out this next poll question. And as you're doing that, I will introduce Dave Kirshner and Kevin Sylvester from our MUTCD team. They're going to go over crosswalk applications, the experiments, and the procedures for experiments with MUTCD related items, and they will also speak on the horizontal curves. Dave and Kevin?
Thanks, Tria. This is Kevin Sylvester. I'm the team leader for the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices in Federal Highway Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I just want to give you a little background on what we do. Ron and Tria talked about what the division does, but what our role is here in headquarters is primarily to develop the MUTCD content and initiate rulemakings to issue new additions or revisions to the MUTCD. As you probably know, the manual is referenced in the Code of Federal Regulations and enabled by federal statute, so it does have the force of law and effectively is federal regulation. And we have to go through basically the federal rulemaking process to do any revisions or new additions to it. And what that entails is publishing what we call a notice of proposed amendments, putting it out to the public and allowing a certain period of time for the public to view it and comment on it. And then we take all the public comments on that proposal and kind of resolve them and determine how we will address them in what we call a final rulemaking, which is basically putting out the final version of the new edition of the manual or that particular revision. We have currently for the 2009 edition, there are actually 2 revisions. So we're on revision number 2, which was issued in 2012. So when we're not working on developing specific content for the manual, because that only happens every so often, not on a continuing basis, we evaluate and approve requests for interpretation, experimentation, which we're going to talk about today, and requests for changes to the manual, as well as consider and issue interim approvals. We also provide technical assistance to the division offices on local issues, local matters, or applications of the MUTCD. We also set policies for new applications that might use the existing provisions of the manual, but perhaps a new concept, new operational concept, for example, might not be specifically addressed in the manual. So sometimes we'll put out memoranda or guidance to the division offices on that. And we also aid in doing substantial conformance reviews. And substantial conformance is what the state has to go through. So in the case of Ohio, you have your own state MUTCD rather than adopting the national manual. The division has to do a review and approval of that, and that's called the substantial conformance review. And what substantial conformance means is that the state manual has to be at the same level of mandate as the national MUTCD, or it can be more strict. So in the MUTCD, we have standards, guidance, and option levels of mandate, and what that means is basically all standards have to be a standard. Guidance statements have to at least be guidance, but they can be standards in the state manual, but you can't take a standard and downgrade it to guidance, for example. So we do assist the divisions with that, with those efforts, and not every state does adopt its own manual or supplement. The one thing we don't do here in headquarters is we don't go out and inspect or police traffic control devices. So usually what we'll do is if we're made aware of a non-compliant situation, we'll bring it to the attention of the division office so that they can address it. And there are different levels of compliance issues. You know, some are very isolated, but some are systemic, and the degree or the manner in which they're addressed can take on different forms. So with that, I just wanted to move on to, as long as I have the line, I'm going to go into the compliance state issue, and hopefully Ron can be ready with what he wanted to say. But I'm going to share my screen just for a moment.
Let me stop sharing the poll so you can share your screen. And while I'm doing that, we did have a question that came in the chat pod from one of the participants concerning, okay, you can go ahead and work on putting your screen up, the issuance of the OMUTCD for 2012. They said after the issuance of that, they had heard that Ohio would use the federal MUTCD going forward, and they want to know if that's still a plan for the future, Ron.
That would be a decision by the state, by ODOT. I know there has been discussions, but those discussions would really start once once headquarters issues the notice of proposed amendments and we work through that and the final rule comes out. Then the states have 2 years to either develop their own manual, or they could also issue a supplement. So I know there's been discussions. I think historically Ohio has always had its own manual, at least for several decades now, if not the entire time. So that'll be something that will be discussed, and ODOT will make the final call on that.
Okay, thanks, Ron. So just a couple of items we just wanted to highlight quickly before we get into the technical content of the specifics of the webinar. There are two compliance dates that were adopted in the 2009 edition of the manual that are coming due at the end of this year. They're both December 31st, 2019, and those can be found in Table I-2, target compliance dates established by the FHWA. It's in the introduction portion of the MUTCD, so that's just before Part 1. And the two dates are for one-way signs. I'm just going to try to highlight them here, and hopefully it doesn't mask out what it is. So one-way signs, there were new requirements adopted in the 2009 edition for the number of one-way signs, primarily at median openings and divided highway crossings, but also potentially at interchanges. And 2C.06 through 2C14, horizontal alignment warning signs. There were the requirements were significantly revised in the 2009 MUTCD about when and where certain horizontal alignment warning signs, such as the large arrow signs or the chevrons, would be required, recommended, or optional. So those dates are coming due in at the end of this year. It was a 10-year compliance date due to the safety concerns. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Ron, did you want to follow up or say anything about that now, or do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple points. First thing is, if you actually go into the Ohio manual, I think it's Table I-3. So that's common for states when they have their own manual. They may add some text and the paragraph numbers will change. But the other key point, that the information is essentially the same. The other key point is, if you actually open the Ohio manual and look at Table I-3, it's not actually current. ODOT publishes a list of, I think it's called known errors. And in that file, which is on ODOT's OMUTCD webpage, you'll see the change that from the original Ohio manual to kind of that revised error sheet. And it's essentially the same information, but just know that in Ohio it's Table I-3. The only other thing I wanted to say is we wanted to mention this because this table of compliance dates is actually hard compliance dates. Anytime a new manual comes out, the requirement is, as devices, signs, or whatever become not serviceable anymore, they're at the end of their service life, when you put in a new sign, then it needs to be compliant with the new manual. Or as you have your program to just replace signs and markings through your regular maintenance schedule, then they need to be updated. But however, until that comes through, then the existing signs are allowed to remain. However, these items that are in this table are actually hard compliance dates, so that when the national manual came out in 2009, that date that you see was 10 years from that time, so that at the end of that 10-year period, those changes to the one-way signs and the horizontal curves need to be in. It's not as though you just wait until you're coming through with your next replacement schedule or anything. So just wanted to have this as a reminder to all agencies that those are actual hard compliance dates, and those devices need to be in by that time. So that's all I had.
Thanks, Ron. That was a good addition to kind of how you transition to new criteria and devices. And I did just want to add, as far as if you're not sure whom to contact, whether it's a headquarters, Federal Highway headquarters function or the division function, just reach out to the division and they'll let us know if we should be involved. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to you guys. I guess Dave's up next.
Yeah, so let me see if I can get my desktop up here. One moment, please. Share monitor 2.
While Dave's doing that, I'll just share a reminder for those of you who may have joined us a few minutes after the start of the webinar that everyone is joining in listen-only mode currently, but there's a conversation/chat panel available on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you can't see it currently, please look for a circle with a thought bubble in it. You can click on that, and then the conversation panel should open, and you can place any questions you have for the presenters in there while the presentation is occurring. And then we do plan to open the phone lines at the end of the presentation for audio questions. There you go.
Okay, so I should have a presentation up there. Victoria, can you let me know that that's just showing up okay?
I can see it. Looks good on my end.
Great. So let me go ahead and introduce myself. As Kevin said, he is the headquarters team leader for the MUTCD team. In addition to Kevin, who kind of oversees the team, there are several of us team members who have subject specialties within the team. So my name is Dave Kirshner. As I said, I am the technical specialist for parts 3 and 9. That's pavement markings and bicycle facilities. So when we were asked to set up this for today, specifically one of the issues that was talked about was crosswalk design. We've got a lot of information that we've pushed out over the last few years on crosswalk design. We've done a lot of interpretations and things like that can apply to it. So I want to make sure that you guys have the most updated information and kind of a little bit of a look as to why we choose to restrict crosswalk design the way that we do, and why we've put out the guidance that we have on that crosswalk design. So we'll go ahead and start moving through the slides here. We've seen a lot of interesting designs over the last few years with crosswalks, especially as marking materials have gotten better, with the ability to mark new and different designs and more vivid colors on the pavement as well. And here's a couple of examples I've shown here of just things that we've seen out in the field. No, no specifics, no locations, anything like that, but colors, designs, things like that. Specifically, even the one on the right, you'll notice is not even doesn't even include any crosswalk lines itself. So there are issues with each one of these individually, and we really want to make sure that we keep the crosswalk design pared down to the most important parts, so it's as clear as possible for people to understand what they're seeing at these intersections and what to take away as a driver and a road user when they see that. Sorry, let me go back here. It's not advancing for some reason. There we go. So since 2001, we've provided several interpretations on crosswalk design and aesthetic materials. I apologize for the background noise. I'm out in an open environment, and I can't really control my my neighbors so much. We've provided several interpretations since 2001 on crosswalk design. And over the years, we've detailed things like that aesthetic treatments that we've been asked about don't show any reduction in crashes, nor do we have any evidence that they provide a benefit to safety. When we look at what goes in the manual, we do it, as somebody said earlier, we do it on a basis of safety and efficiency. What we want to do is make sure that anything that changes or anything that departs from what we already have in the manual does so for a purpose of increasing safety or increasing efficiency. We've done research on crosswalk design over the years, and we've not found any benefit to safety or efficiency by incorporating additional aesthetic treatment. So what we want to do is make sure that that aesthetic treatment, when it's installed and within the bounds of what we allow, doesn't detract from the crosswalk design that's there. So one of the most important things that was established in interpretation was that retroreflectivity in aesthetic treatments is not allowed. That can specifically detract, especially at night, from the visibility of the crosswalk lines itself, whichever marking that's chosen, whether it's a continental, bar pairs, or a standard transverse line. We also have noted in our interpretations that much of these crosswalk art or crosswalk designs that have been installed can really degrade the contrast of the white lines that's required. That's the most important element that we see there. That's what we want the driver and the pedestrian to both see and instantly recognize what that meaning is and what that space is for. And what we've found with a lot of these art designs is that they can degrade from that contrast, not even taking into account the distraction, but just degrade from the contrast, the visual contrast that those white lines provide from the pavement. So our latest official ruling in a list of interpretations that we've done over the years is called, in our very easy to follow manner, official ruling 309-24I. And it's available on our website. If you look on the left side of our website, I've got an image later on of how it's laid out. But if you look on our website on the left side, there's a little bar that says Interpretations. You can click on that to find this information spelled out in full. There's a lot of text there, not just on crosswalk design, but on various uses of colored pavement, including how to use colored pavement for things like flush median islands, or a lot of other examples where you can use colored or textured pavements to fill in or add contrast. So I would definitely refer you to that. It's much too long to go over all of those things in detail here today, but you can learn a lot if you just want to go through that to find out more information on approved uses of colored pavement. But what I want to focus on today is how that applies to crosswalks. And what we noted in the interpretation is just because you have the transverse lines or just because you have the longitudinal lines of the crosswalk doesn't mean that there's free reign to change the design within those transverse lines. Limited aesthetic treatments are permitted. And what we want to do is make sure when we limit these treatments that we're keeping to the contrast of the lines and keeping the meaning clear of the crosswalk lines. So some examples are things like bricks, pavers, cobblestones, simulated versions like stamped concrete, or a grid pattern that can be marked onto the pavement. The treatment must be uniform and consistent. What we're looking for is something like a pattern, something that doesn't have pictographs, symbols, especially words, or any attempts to communicate with the driver. We don't want the driver's eye to linger on that crosswalk any longer than it absolutely has to understand the meaning of it. And like I said, you can find the full text of the interpretation on our website if you want to read a little bit more detail about these things, and as well as, like I said, the application of colored pavement for uses beyond crosswalks. So why do we maintain such a strict policy of guidance? And why do we restrict the use of colored pavement as we do? So as I said, it's very important, perhaps most critically with pedestrian deaths showing an increase, as Ron mentioned. We have to make sure that especially the driver, when they see that crosswalk, can recognize it and understand its meaning immediately and in the moment. We're competing with a lot more than we ever did when we look at traffic control devices. We're competing with phones, with in-car entertainment, with heads-up displays, with dashboards that are pretty much just iPads these days. And we know from research that any distraction of more than about 2 seconds significantly compromises the driver's ability to react and perform safely in the moment. The MUTCD standard crosswalks are tested and verified that road users understand what they mean and understand their responsibilities when they see that. What we want to do is make sure that we keep the crosswalk to that standard so that it takes the absolute minimum time possible for that driver to see that, understand, and react appropriately, and then continue scanning the roadway for any other concerns, other traffic, or anything else. The purpose of these aesthetic treatments is to draw the driver's eye. If not, I mean, there would be no other reason to do so. There would be no other reason to increase that, basically to add that kind of different visual flair to it, unless you're trying to draw the driver's eye. We already know that the standard crosswalk is easily understood. The aesthetic treatment doesn't have a purpose for safety and operations. It's merely to do placemaking or artistic use, which is a valid concern, but not something that we want to address within the roadway, because we are so concerned with how that driver interprets that, reacts, and performs in the moment. The other issue we have with these crosswalk designs is the increased use and the increased presence of automated driving systems in vehicles. More and more vehicles these days are coming with things like autopilot, things like driver assist that attempt to read and interpret the markings on the roadway. We simply don't know how they can process these things, and we simply don't know what the systems react to when they see things like this. We want to make absolutely clear what these locations are within the roadway, so that they are crosswalks, that there are locations where you can expect to have pedestrians crossing, and we don't want any of these technologies to be confused by something that's been put on the roadway. And speaking purely as a practical concern, we'll get a request for interpretation on something like this. On its face, that's not that different than some of the designs we allow, and maybe you could tweak it. But what we have to do is make sure that we balance the request for individuality or things like that with, something further, something like that. obviously we'd have a bit of an issue with installing that. We really want to make sure it's not that we want to stifle any kind of placemaking or any kind of municipal identity or anything like that. We're purely concerned with the safety of the pedestrian and the safety of the driver when we consider that these markings have to be absolutely uniform. Some of the examples that you can use for compliant aesthetic treatments within crosswalks are shown here. Red bricks, stamped concrete, simulated cobblestones. All of these add a little visual interest without detracting from those crosswalk lines, without adding distraction for the driver or anything that's going to specifically draw the driver's eye. We don't want something that you're going to have on the pavement that the driver's going to sit there and stare at for more than that 2 seconds that I spoke of earlier that really compromises their attention. And especially if they're trying to sit there and figure out and stare at something and wonder what it is. That's a purpose that's absolutely counter to safety and operations on the roadway, which is what we're really concerned about. But we do understand that there's a lot of concern, especially in the locals, about placemaking and kind of beautification, and these are some ways you can do that within the roadway that maintain that safety purpose of the crosswalk. I also wanted to show a couple examples of things you can do outside of the roadway where we really encourage placemaking, where we encourage beautification efforts, things like that. Here's a couple of kind of sculptures that have been installed on the light poles. This is from our neighborhood here in Washington, D.C. And then I've got an example of a colored pavement art installation on a off-street pedestrian path. That's from Charlotte, North Carolina, I believe. So there's a lot of options to be able to incorporate placemaking and art outside of the roadway where we're not going to have that concern with the driver being distracted by anything in the roadway. So Victoria, I don't know if you want to stop and take questions now or...
That's perfect timing because we just had one come into the chat pod. And it says, what is your advice when a city council requires their city administration to install a rainbow crosswalk?
Well, it's a difficult position to be put in, and I certainly understand that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the potential risks later on in the presentation of doing something that isn't compliant with the MUTCD. But one of the things I would point to is that installing a non-compliant traffic control device really puts the locality, puts the jurisdiction at risk. I'm reluctant to detail too much because I'm not an attorney, but I can say that what we've been told is that potentially installing a non-compliant traffic control device can open a jurisdiction up to tort liability should something happen at that location. Even over and above all the reasons that I spoke of, is maintaining safety, maintaining clarity, and maintaining understanding. There is a liability question when you install something that isn't compliant with the MUTCD. When you keep that compliance, you're protected by the standards that are backed up by the force of federal law. If you deviate from that, it can run a significant risk to liability, and not to mention, like I said, the safety of the persons crossing the roadway. So yeah, that's probably what I would say about the rainbow crosswalks. I think we're going to do, as Kevin said earlier, we periodically are able to update the MUTCD. That is a process that is likely ongoing. It is ongoing. We are working on that now. We were given the go-ahead last year by the secretary to update the MUTCD. So that's something we're working on now, and we'll be including significantly expanded language on this subject, which will be, for the most part, consistent with what you see in that 309-24. So that'll be even easier to be able to point to and just say that this is not something that's permitted within the roadway. And then I think you can suggest other alternatives to add that placemaking, to add that interest outside of the roadway where it could potentially compromise safety.
David, this is Truia. I also want to add for the locals that are out there, if there's a clear compliance issue, or if you're being directed to install an application that is not in compliance with MUTCD, it's something that you can go ahead and either let us know, we can push it up our chain of command to, you know.
Tria, did we lose you?
Oh, did you? Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you, Taria.
Oh, everyone else can't. That's interesting. Oh, okay. Well, I don't know what to do.
Well, you know what? Let's give it a second, and I'll go ahead and read off another question.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like they can hear me. Oh, I just wanted to say that you can always either contact our office, you can contact ODOT, and ODOT and our office have a direct relationship. So, I mean, there are avenues to maybe express your concern if you're put in that position, and we can always, expedite it again through our chain of command and provide support so that we would hate for something to get installed that it puts everyone in an uncomfortable position where we may have to ask that it's removed.
Taria, I wanted to add in too, just from my perspective with my background, that I would definitely encourage them not only to talk to you guys, but to take the information to their city attorney and present them with this information from the webinar, and what they're being directed to do with the Rainbow Crosswalk, and involve their legal counsel, because I'm fairly certain that they will help to explain what the requirements are once they review it. We do have another question that's come into the chat pod I'd like to read off, because we have a few right behind it as well. It says, will you please clarify that the white transverse lines are still required in addition to / over the concrete bands for brick crosswalks?
Yeah, I will absolutely clarify that. The white transverse lines are always required when you're marking a crosswalk. That doesn't get into the area that there are such things as unmarked crosswalks, and that's going to depend on the applicable legal code of the jurisdiction. But speaking in the general, whenever you have sidewalks that coincide with an intersection, typically that area where that sidewalk would be extended through the intersection is legally treated as a crosswalk. Disclaimers, your mileage may vary, check your local code to be sure, but typically that's the arrangement that's legally in place at a crosswalk. But if you do mark the crosswalk, it has to be done with those white crosswalk markings, either transverse lines or longitudinal or the bar pair style. But yes, if the crosswalk's marked, it does have to have those white crosswalk markings.
Okay, I've gotten the next question here for you. It says, we've heard that stamped concrete is difficult for some with disabilities, and in parentheses they've placed causing vibrations, etc. Is there clarity about using stamped concrete in crosswalks when looking at ADA, etc.?
I have heard that concern. I am not an ADA expert, so I'm not going to pretend to be a definitive authority on that. Tria or Ron, I don't know if you have additional experience with that, but what I would say is that if that is a concern where you are, you can always defer to something like a simulated paver. So that's actually installed with just a marking that has a grid embedded in it that kind of looks like brick or looks like cobblestones, but doesn't actually have any texture to it. I don't know, Tria or Ron, if you have any additional ADA perspective on that.
I don't. As a practitioner for a state DOT, we never had any complaints that came through from ADA organizations for the stamped concrete, but we can touch base with our ADA coordinator here in our office, and Brian, I can circle back with you and see if our office has heard anything on that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example of something that if you're not sure, please reach out to our division office, and they're tapped into all sorts of expertise throughout federal highways, not just MUTCD. We have several very accomplished ADA experts at federal highways that we have the resources to be able to contact for these type of questions.
Okay, the next question is, I believe that Europe has installed 3D crosswalks. Why is it safe in Europe and not in the US?
Oh, I like this question. So you've probably seen going around the photo, I believe it's from Iceland, of a 3D look crosswalk. If you haven't seen that photo, it's basically a standard longitudinal continental-style crosswalk with kind of a drop shadow at marking added to make it look like there are boxes in the roadway. And on the face of it, you look at that, we say, well, I'd definitely stop if I saw that. That definitely draws my attention. And a lot of jurisdictions thought that, and hence we've received several requests to experiment with that design. That was actually allowed out on the roadway in a couple of jurisdictions, and when you kind of think it through, what we found might not surprise you. We found that people did tend to reduce their speed when they saw this thing. People did tend to slow down when they saw the 3D marked crosswalk. What we also saw, which again, when you think it through, might make a bit of sense, what we also saw was drivers were actually swerving out of their lanes when they saw this thing. When they saw an object that if they believed it was real ahead of us, they would actually swerve out of the way to avoid hitting this thing. And we saw that in up to about 15% of drivers when they were first installed would actually swerve out of their lane or make some other unexpected maneuver when they saw it. That number did go down over time, but maintained at a level of about 10% of drivers swerving or making some other type of unexpected maneuver when they saw that. And that represents a huge risk for us to put on the roadway, and as a result of that experiment, we did ask the jurisdiction to remove it, and we're not currently permitting experimentation with that design because of the significant risk that we have 15% of drivers when they initially see that are potentially swerving into another lane or into off of the roadway or onto the shoulder. If it's something that had a significant enough concern behind it, I think what we would ask somebody to do is take it into a closed course setting, something like a simulator, and show us some way that marking could be used that would mitigate that secondary effect. But based on the effects that we saw when it was marked on the roadway, the secondary concern, that kind of unintended side effect, was too significant a safety concern, and as a result, we're not permitting additional experimentation with that.
Okay, I've got one more question so far here in the chat pod. It says, has there been research done to show that these more aesthetic treatments have decreased safety?
To my knowledge, there has not been research done showing that they have decreased safety. I would have to, I put an asterisk on that because I don't have those materials in front of me to look at. But what I would say is that that's not really the way that the MUTCD works. So what we try and do is that any change to the MUTCD, any diversion from the standards in the MUTCD, really has to be done for a purpose to improve safety and operations. To show that what we're doing improves on the MUTCD or somehow fills a need that, a traffic control need that the MUTCD does not provide. Because the other point is that U in the MUTCD, which is uniformity. What we need to make sure is that instant reaction response. What we need to make sure is that these are ingrained in the driver. Things like when you see a red octagon, you stop. When you see a solid yellow line, you need to be on the right side of that solid yellow line. Those are automatic responses, and that's provided by the degree of uniformity that's in the manual. And that's something that's very difficult to actually study and something that's very difficult to substantiate through statistics, but we do know that uniformity breeds a quicker reaction and breeds a quicker and deeper understanding of things that when they see them. And that's why we don't, without research showing that something is an improvement, we don't include things just because it's an alternative, because we do want to maintain that innate response when somebody sees a traffic control device, and that's what's compromised when you start to add aesthetic treatments.
Okay, I think we're good to keep moving forward. That was the last question for now.
So I hit on a couple of these points that you'll see I'm going to discuss when I discuss experimentation. But let's move forward with experimentation under the MUTCD. This is how we would use a traffic control device that isn't in the MUTCD or isn't approved under an interim approval. You can find additional information on experimentation. This is what I said earlier about the website. On the left side of our website, there's a word that says experimentations. You can click on that and find additional information on experimentation, what experiments are being done, what's out there now, and information on how to go through the process. There's also, as I said earlier, a bar further down, kind of off the screen than you see here, that says interpretations, where you can find out more information, and I believe the link was posted as well to that interpretation. So like I said earlier, official experimentation allows agencies to test new or innovative traffic control devices or applications. Applications being any use of an approved traffic control device that isn't something listed in the MUTCD. So something you'd want to use an approved traffic control device in a different manner. And there are two reasons that you would do this. If the device is expected to be an improvement on what's in the MUTCD, an improvement on the compliant device, or because you found a gap that the manual doesn't effectively address, that there's a situation on the roadway or based on the roadway design that the MUTCD just has nothing to actually address that.
Quick question from the chat pod. Are there any changes expected to the MUTCD crosswalk warrants?
So there's not a lot in the MUTCD about warrants for crosswalks, about justification for crosswalks. A lot of that is done on the state or local level. A lot of states have developed, and I don't have direct experience in Ohio with this, but a lot of states have developed guidelines based on things like pedestrian volume, sidewalk network, things like that. As of right now, we're not expecting to put additional information on when a jurisdiction would choose to install a crosswalk. Other than, if you have a mid-block crossing, you must have a crosswalk marking to establish that crosswalk. Outside of that, we probably are not going to get into that in the MUTCD just because that ends up being more of a design guide question than a traffic control devices question. So I'll go back to the experimentation question for now. So why is it important to participate in the experimental process? This is what I was mentioning earlier. If a jurisdiction decides to install a non-compliant device, there are direct risks beyond just the potential compromising of safety and understanding of road users. There's potential legal liability if a crash occurs to the jurisdiction. In extreme cases, a jurisdiction can lose federal aid money if they knowingly install non-compliant devices and don't work to come back into compliance with federal highways. That's not something that regularly happens, but it is an option should something get to that point of seriousness that we would need to discuss it with the jurisdiction. From the positive side rather than the risk side, the data from experimentation is critical to evaluating and adopting new devices into the MUTCD. When we do things like interim approvals, which is allow the use of a traffic control device without experimentation between updates to the MUTCD, that is typically based on positive outcomes from experimentations from jurisdictions that have installed these things, have been working with us, and then have justified that there's an improvement to safety and operations. That data is absolutely critical to be able to include these devices into the MUTCD. So I'll show you a couple of examples and just describe how these went from experiments through to adoption in the manual. Just to give you an idea of the scale of experimentation, this data is a little bit out of date, but between 2008 and 2017, there were 176 experiments approved by federal highways. And during the same period, only 14 requests were denied. We're proud of that ability to be able to work with the jurisdictions to come to an experimental process that we can both agree on, something that's practical for the jurisdiction, as well as gaining valuable knowledge and insight on how these devices perform for federal highways. So it starts with an idea. It starts with a jurisdiction coming up with an idea that fills a gap or improves on something in the manual that can be potentially done better. So you have something like the pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is in the top left here. That was originally started as an experiment and was ultimately included in the manual in the 2009 edition. And then we have a couple of things that started as experimentation that have now been given interim approval that can be used with just a request letter. You see on the bottom, that's a two-stage bicycle turn box. I believe that one's in San Francisco. And then we have a bicycle-specific signal face to control the operation of the intersection for the bicycle lane specifically. That is interim approval 16. Both of those started as experimentation, and what we saw was that the effect on operations when they were used in the manner with which they are approved with the interim approvals, the effect on operations was significant enough of an improvement to warrant issuing an interim approval for those before we were able to update the manual to include that content. That there was enough of a reason there was enough of a justification showed by the positive results of these experiments that we moved to allow a more significant approval before the next update to the manual.
While you're changing slides there, I just wanted to mention that there was another comment that came into the chat pod concerning the driving manual covering only standard markings and signs, for example, yellow, white, solid, dashed, so innovative treatments are not understood by drivers, and that this person wishes the manual included new TCDs like roundabouts. I put back in the chat pod as a response that Ohio actually is working with the office, our safety office here at ODOT's working with the Office of Public Safety that has ownership over the driver's manual to get roundabouts included in the update of the manual. And if you want more information on this process, I know that Michelle May would be happy to talk to you about that, and I've put her email address in the chat pod. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really important comment. You know, as we work in our little corner of the world to be able to make sure that the MUTCD reflects the most current knowledge and the state of the practice, it's also really important to get out ahead of these things once they're released and make sure the public understands what they're seeing out there. What we've seen is that our Office of Safety produces a lot of materials for innovative traffic control devices. So we've produced, and I'm not a subject matter expert for the Office of Safety's programs, but I can tell you that they've produced a lot of public materials for how to use, pedestrian hybrid beacons specifically, and other devices that have been added to be able to distribute, so jurisdictions understand them, and then the hope is that the jurisdictions are be able to go out and do some kind of public outreach when these things are first installed. That is one of the things that we look at when we look at an experimental device, is that whether drivers, when they observe that for the first time, are taking away the operational effect that we intend to. And that's, it's an important measure. We have to ultimately install something that doesn't need other devices to be able to explain how that device operates. But we do, through our Office of Safety, put out a lot of public material to be able to understand and be able to clarify the use of these new devices when we do put them out. So I'll go back to the experimentation slides, excuse me. So for the full description of the experimental process, that's provided in section 1A10 of the MUTCD. One of the most important items there is that only only agencies having jurisdiction over the roadways may apply for experimentation. Typically, that's a state DOT or a local DOT. We have received requests from colleges and universities who own and maintain the roadways, as well as different units of the National Park Service have also applied for experimentation. The process is that the roadway agency will submit a request letter to us at headquarters, and if there's ever any question about that, you can start that outreach process to us directly at headquarters, or you can do that with our division contacts as well, and they will loop us in. We do work together on these type of things just to make sure everybody's in the loop, so please feel free to reach out if there are any questions on how you would request experimentation. So when that request is submitted, it also includes a research plan on how you would examine this potential experimental device that you're requesting to use. The request has to be based around that research plan. How do we evaluate the efficacy of this experimental device? It's a basic scientific process, a basic experimental approach. What is the device expected to accomplish? If I install this device, this is what I am expecting people will react when they see it. This is what I intend, and this is what I'm hoping to see. One of the most important things that we do when we look at experimental plans is look at how that baseline or control will be established for the experimental device. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to put this in and see what happens. We have to make sure that we have a situation against which we can evaluate that, where all other factors are equal except for the experimental device. A good example of this is red-colored pavement for transit only and transit priority lanes. We get a lot of requests for that. We've approved several experiments with that. They're ongoing. The results so far are fairly positive. in improving operations and improving the conspicuity of that transit lane. But one of the things that we do when we look at a request for something like that is that we would have to see that lane in operation without the colored pavement, with every other thing equal. So the signs, the markings, and the lane restrictions all installed. We'd have to see how that lane operates under those conditions. And then, with the only change being the red colored pavement, go back and see how those same operations are affected. And that way we can isolate the effect of that single traffic control device on the system as a whole, and we can evaluate whether that hypothesis is actually being borne out in the field. The research plan should state what data will be collected, as well as how the data will be evaluated to determine whether or not the traffic control device is working. I've included a little example here from one of the two-stage turnbox experiments, just to show you how on some of these experiments, the need for that data collection can be relatively simple, can be observational in nature. What this showed, for example, what we wanted out of this jurisdiction was, once we placed that two-stage turn box, how many cyclists are using that two-stage turn box versus merging into a left turn lane to turn left. And when they're using that, where are they actually placing themselves? Are they placing themselves within the turn box, partially, or entirely outside of the turn box? What we wanted to see was, if we place this in the right-of-way, we can see whether or not people will understand it and whether or not they'll use it as intended. And that's something that can be done in that case with a relatively simple operation. We do recognize that sometimes, especially for smaller jurisdictions, this can be difficult, and it can be a little more of a burden than on a larger jurisdiction, or a state especially. That can include things like development of the research plan, especially the data collection and analysis effort, as well as the submission of semi-annual progress reports and a final report for the experiment. Oftentimes these can stress the available resources that a local agency especially has, and it can discourage them from doing experimentation where they might have a good idea or where they might have something that could be an improvement. The idea of the process can sometimes discourage agencies from participating. So how can they get help with experimentation? For research planning, especially for coming up with that plan, please reach out to us on the MUTCD team, or start with Tria, our contact in the division. And what we can do is really help you work on that research plan to figure out, distill it to what we very much need to know about that device and its operation in the field. And that can really affect that data collection and analysis process, because what it could end up being is something as simple as doing observations during a selection of peak hours, just sending somebody out a few hours a day to observe and record how the device is performing in the field. It can be done sometimes with simple tube counts to get speed and volume effects of a device. What we can do is really help remove a lot of the unnecessary burden that may be involved. Depending on how you look at these experiments and how you look at these devices, there may be, we may need fewer rounds of data collection than you might think, but we're really happy to work with a jurisdiction who's got something to bring to the table to be able to get an experimental plan that's something that's practical for them, that they can accomplish, and then they can get us a useful result. And you saw on that previous page where the observation can be as simple as something very brief like that, just to make sure how people are using the device and that they're using it in the manner that we intend. And finally, on this point, the progress reports. I think this is often seen as a barrier to jurisdictions being able to go through the experimentation process, that we do require semi-annual progress reports and ultimately a final report on the efficacy of the device. Progress reports don't need to be a full, formatted 500-page. I went a little overboard with this one, but it doesn't need to be a peer-reviewed journal article for a progress report. A lot of the times, what we'll do, is semi-annually, every 6 months, we expect to get a progress report from the agency, and that could be something as simple as the project with the device involved is going out for bid. It's under contract. We hope to proceed with installation, in June or something like that. The progress report can be just that, reporting on the progress of the experiment. It doesn't have to be anything necessarily more complicated than that. If there's been a round of data collection between the previous report and the current one, Next time it's scheduled to give us a progress report, just let us know what data was collected. Let us know what was in there. It doesn't have to be any more of a burden than that. It should, just to let us know what's going on with the experiment at that moment in time. And then once it comes to the final report, usually that's a period of anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on the plan. Just let us, provide that data according to the research plan. Let us know, this was the metric we were looking for. This is what we found. And ultimately, this is the conclusion we reached as far as the efficacy of this device. We've received some that are extremely long, extremely detailed. We've received some that are very to the point. But we're always, very happy to work with the jurisdiction to come to a plan that we can both agree on and we can both see as an improvement and something that can help us move forward on these devices. I've been a little non-specific in this slide as far as other avenues that jurisdictions can use because it does depend on the state and what's available in the area. But just based on experience we've had with experimentation, there are other avenues for smaller local jurisdictions that can reach out potentially to things like a university civil engineering department. If there's grad students who are willing and happy to be able to work on something, that's great. If your state DOT has a research division to do some of this kind of work, as well as LTAP programs or tech transfer centers to be able to do anything from a knowledge exchange to anything beyond that if they're able to. Again, I'm not specifically familiar with the programs in Ohio, but these are things that we've worked with in the past in other jurisdictions to be able to provide technical assistance for local jurisdictions wishing to go through that experimental process to kind of help them raise up to the point where they're able to take on the project and complete it.
We'd be happy to help here in Ohio as well. All they need to do is just contact us.
Yeah, that's great. So that's all I had prepared on the experimental process. I'm happy to take any other questions that we have or anything else that Tria or Ron, you'd like us to cover while we're here.
Yeah, we had a couple of comments regarding experimentations or experiments. For the locals and the state, oftentimes our preference would be for you to touch base with us here at the division only before you send your request to headquarters, only because it allows for us to maybe triage and help you want to be able to review and provide support in your justification for the experiment before it gets to headquarters. Or sometimes we are able to maybe discuss and walk through why it may not be a good candidate for an experiment as well. So that is one thing that we want to mention.
So Tria, there is a question kind of related to that. They'd like to know if you keep a list of experiments that are underway.
Yeah, so I did see that come up, and if you look on the screen, I'm hoping you can see my cursor on the left-hand side of the MUTCD homepage. You see something that says experimentation. That's where the information is provided. We also have what we call the official rulings database. So if you go on the left side of the page right here and you click official rulings, what you'll see come up there is our official rulings database. And what you can do there is you can look up every experiment, because an experiment is an official ruling under the MUTCD. So, for example, if you want to find out everything that was done with a bike facility, every experiment that's done on a bike facility since the 2009 edition, what you would do in this box at the top, scroll down to Part 9, bicycle facilities, select the 2009 edition, and select experiment. I'm just going to leave all these other untouched, but you can see you can filter it by active, denied, or completed. You can filter by state, and you can filter by year, as well as looking for different keywords for common experiments that we put into the system to be able to allow people to find those common experiments more easily. So when I hit search, what you'll see is it comes up with all of the experiments under Part 9 for bicycle facilities that have been conducted under the 2009 edition. So that's a very long way of answering. Yes, we absolutely do keep a list of experiments that are ongoing, and that's available on our website if you go to that official rulings database, again, on that left side of the page.
There's another question that's come into the chat pod. I'll read off real quick. Sorry, Tria. It says, in updating the MUTCD, what areas are you focusing on?
Kevin, did you want to take that, or you want me to take a crack at it? He may be muted. So I will say that as part of the MUTCD update was announced as part of the Secretary's effort to prepare the USDOT for the advent of automated vehicles. And that's one thing that we will be including a little bit more guidance and a little bit more of a standard that's based on the research we have that's established that can help the needs of automated driving systems. So where we have conclusive research that things like wider edge lines, for example, can help automated driving systems, we will be considering that as we update the manual. So that's something that we're looking at as well. I think what you'll see is a significant change, probably the most significant change in the manual will be to Part 9, bicycle facilities, just because that area of the engineering practice has evolved so significantly since the last edition of the manual was published in 2009. You have things like the NACTO guidebooks that are attempting to address that. You have a revision that's ongoing right now to the AASHTO Bicycle Design Guide. And as well as you have federal highway documents like the Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide that attempt to address that area of design. And all of that has kind of happened since the previous manual was issued. And so I think you'll see a lot of significant changes in Part 9, a lot of expansion to address that demand that's out there. As you know, there are going to be a lot of changes throughout the manual as well. But I think as far as the most significant and most expansive changes will probably be to Part 9. I don't know if Kevin was able to get himself unmuted, or
I'm just trying to make sure that's his phone number that was promoted into the presenters area.
It should be the one ending 2161.
Okay, good. I'm going to unmute him then. I just want to make sure before I unmuted it. Yeah. Kevin, is that you?
Okay, it looks like I'm unmuted. So I think Dave gave a pretty thorough answer. Basically, what areas are we focusing on? I mean, it is going to be a completely new edition. That's the intent. So it will really focus on where the gaps are since the last manual, kind of across the board. It's not going to be necessarily focused in one particular area. That's more of a revision type of approach, which is where we just take a particular area and do a small revision. This is going to be a completely new edition of the manual.
So we have a couple of questions, Kevin and Dave. In regard to experiments, is the team currently accepting new requests?
Yes, of course.
Absolutely we are.
Okay.
But are there certain devices that aren't being considered? Like, for example, you mentioned the 3D crosswalks that ended up not working out as we hoped. So we assume like a device like that is not being considered for experiment. Are there certain other ones that aren't being considered that agencies would benefit to know in case they're considering those?
Off the top of, yes, there are. Off the top of my head, just because I haven't done the background work, we are not currently accepting experimental requests for the use of green-colored pavement behind a shared lane marking. The idea would be, I guess, to increase the conspicuity of the shared lane marking, but the experiments with that device so far have not shown a significant improvement in operational effect as far as helping to determine the lateral position of the bicyclist or having a road user, a vehicle, give that bicyclist more room when they're passing. And as a result, we've seen that it's more important to reserve that green color to denote an exclusive space for bicycles within the roadway, to keep the meaning of that uniform and clear, that when you see an area with green color, that's an area for bicyclists to operate, that's not an area to be driving in. And so as a result, we're not accepting additional requests for that design. I'm sure there are others. those are the ones that are off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah,
great.
I'll just add in. I think if we go back to, I mean, the other thing we probably won't accept requests for are things that have already been denied. There's a thought that if enough people request experimentation with it, eventually we'll approve it. And the going back to what Dave talked about with the purpose of a traffic control device and the purpose of an experiment is to kind of look at that initial test of what is the purpose of experimenting with this device. Is it going to be an improvement over what the manual has now? One thing we try to shy away from and avoid is looking at taking the perspective of, well, maybe we'll just prove that it doesn't do any harm, and that's really not the purpose of a traffic control device. Otherwise, the manual would be kind of endless if we looked at everything, many different ways of doing the same thing, and that really contravenes the uniformity principle and really does not do the road user a positive service. And I noticed there was a, I'll leave it at that for now. We can go on to other questions.
I've got two more questions for you guys in the chat pod right now. The first one says, are all changes to the MUTCD approved by the NCUTCD?
Okay, I'll take that one. So the NCUTCD, the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, is a volunteer organization. Their sole purpose is to look at changes to traffic control device standards. They're not affiliated at all with Federal Highway Administration. They're not an official advisory board. They do a lot of work amongst their members, though, a lot of good work. But there is no requirement for change requests to go through and or be approved by that organization. They initiate a lot of requests for change to the manual, and they submit, that organization submits those requests to us, and we give those due consideration just as we do requests from other organizations or other individuals. However, the Federal Highway Administration also initiates its own changes to the MUTCD. So it's not a case where the NCUTCD, quote unquote, writes the manual, as it were. They're one contributor to it, certainly, and probably, as far as I know, the only organization whose sole focus is the MUTCD, as opposed to, say, AASHTO, who has a committee that deals with it, but their focus as an organization is much broader. But there is there's no formal process or requirement that anything that something has to be approved by that committee before we would consider it.
Hey, Kevin, this is Ron in Ohio. Real quick, I know the NCUTCD publishes their proposed revisions to the manual, proposed language changes, and they have a history of that on their website going back ever since the manual came out. How should agencies view that information on there? Is that just information only? I mean, there's some things on there that are
and we're actually working with them to kind of clarify what the status or disposition of those recommendations is. They should view those simply as something that committee has recommended to Federal Highway Administration, and those are things that we might be considering for a future revision. They don't have any status other than that. They don't have any official or unofficial, as far as we're concerned, status other than that. They're not given any sort of higher level of consideration for. I mean, we've gotten questions on whether people can just, since it's been approved by a national committee, can people just start doing this? And the answer is no. Any changes to the manual have to go through, the formal rulemaking process for public comment and review. There might be devices or applications that the committee has recommended that are currently under experimentation. or under interim approval. So we would certainly, if there is an interim approval issued for something or experimentation request, we would consider under that regard. But we can't issue either a direct change to the manual or an interim approval solely on the basis of a National Committee recommendation. There has to be a legitimate basis behind it, a scientific basis behind it.
Great, thank you for that.
We've got
just real quick, if anybody would like to see those change requests that have been submitted to us, so where any organization, including the National Committee, has submitted a request to change the manual, those are out as well available under that official rulings database. The only thing you would do is you would click on 2009 for the addition, and then instead of experiment for the request type, you would click on change. And when you search that, that'll show you all of the change requests that we've received since the 2009 edition, and kind of what we've been requested to change within the manual, what the nature of that is as well. So those are available if you'd like to see those.
Great. I've got 3 more questions.
Hey, can I just interrupt for 1 second? Hey, sure. Dave, can you bring back up the your internet page there from the website? I just want to put in a shameless plug for on the home page. Can you just point out the e-subscribe service?
Oh, great idea.
Yeah, we do have a. It's right where Dave's cursor is jumping around. We do have an e-subscribe service that if you sign up for that service, you'll get a notification anytime there's a change to our web page, and that can be, or let me rephrase that, a significant change to the web page where there's new information that might be of value to you, such as we've issued an interpretation that's kind of nationally applicable, or there's a new interim approval out, or other types of useful information like that. We don't spam you, and we don't sell your contact information to other people. It's pretty rare, only a few times a year, not even once a month, that we'll put out a bulletin, on those things. So it's really only when there's something useful. It's not even any sort of a newsletter or anything like that. On occasion, we will put out what we call a knowledge lane bulletin, which is just a kind of an informational, almost a one-pager type of informal thing on a particular topic, just to kind of remind people that there are criteria in the manual associated with things, and usually just gives you a link to go to those sections, but it's just to raise awareness to those particular issues. But like I said, it's less frequent than once a month even. So it's a good way for you not to have to come back frequently to check and see what's new. You'll just get a notification anytime there is something new there. So thanks.
Okay, I'm going to read off the next question now. How about in-pavement LEDs at crosswalks?
Yeah, I'll take this. So there's a couple of ways to use in-pavement LEDs, or the official term would be internally illuminated raised pavement markers at crosswalks. So that's actually the only compliant use in the manual for a flashing in-pavement light is at a crosswalk, and that detail is provided in Chapter 4. So the typical application is pedestrian-activated yellow in-pavement flashing lights at a crosswalk. That is compliant with the manual. Like I said, it's in Chapter 4. I can look up the citation offline in a minute, but that would be the only current compliant use of flashing in-pavement lights, which is at a crosswalk. The other option, should you choose to do so, is that internally illuminated pavement markers can be used to supplement pavement markings as any other raised pavement marker can be. So if you chose to put illuminated pavement markers in the same color as the marking, so in this case white, you could also use those at a crosswalk. They would just have to be solid instead of flashing.
Okay, the next question. Will there be any changes to the warrants for the pedestrian hybrid beacons in the next edition?
As of right now, I'm really not sure we can comment on any specifics.
Okay.
Correct.
Next question.
I have a question, Kevin and Dave. Could you maybe let everyone know the time frame that agencies can expect to receive a response to their requests for experimentation?
Sure. So it can vary depending on the the scope of the experiment, but typically we say about 6 weeks, and that's kind of under normal conditions. Right now we're working on the new edition of the manual, so our response times are sometimes a little bit longer. I will say that when you submit something to the official mailbox, there is an automatic reply that kind of gives you the time frames. There's no harm in just checking in with us to see if we can, a few weeks later to see if we have an expected time frame, or just to confirm that we got it. But it might take a little bit longer depending on the scope of the experiment and how unique it is. If it's an experiment we've seen before from another agency, it might go quicker. Yeah, but typically we like to say a minimum of about 6 weeks.
The other tip I'll just give anybody who's considering submitting an experiment request is it can sometimes be quicker to just send it directly to the team member whose technical area it would fall into. Sometimes it takes us a little longer to get things out of the official request inbox. So while we do list that on the website, it can sometimes be quicker to just go to our contact information, which is on. So if you go to the website here on the left side, MUTCD team, click on that. You can see.
Dave, let me interrupt you just for 1 second. Please do submit it to the official request box anyway. It's fine if you copy the team member though, so he gets it directly.
Yep. That seems like a better idea then.
All right, I'm going to read off the next question. It's in the chat pod. There is a traffic control handbook which has some good background discussion. Is there any thought being given to making such discussion available online?
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question, so I'm going to answer what I think is being asked. But the Traffic Control Devices Handbook is, I believe, an ITE publication. Federal Highways doesn't have the Traffic Control Device Handbook anymore. And I know the way that's written, it kind of goes by chapters and topics, and there's a particular author that does each chapter, possibly. It's not necessarily vetted by FHWA, although we'll usually get it for a review at some point. But what goes in there in the final content isn't necessarily always either consistent with the MUTCD or potentially with what our guidance to the public has been in the past. So it's always good to kind of check in with us on those things. As far as a discussion online, I'm not sure. Maybe if that could be. Oh, I see. Didn't realize FHWA was not doing a handbook any longer. Okay, so I see. So as far as putting it online, yeah, obviously that's not our publication, so we can't put it online.
Okay.
But it's a good resource nonetheless.
Another question says, is there a minimum review period for an experimental device?
So there's nothing hard and fast in the manual, but it would have to be a time period that would allow for not only an initial observation, but an observation over time to make sure that the effect of the device hasn't worn off or it hasn't faded into kind of complacency. Typically, the shortest experiments I can think of are about a year, just to allow for, like I said, that initial reaction period, kind of the acclimation, and then the follow-up to make sure that the operation is still consistent. A lot of that depends on what type of device it is and how many observations or how many encounters you're going to get with that device. So something like when the rapid flash beacon, rectangular rapid flash beacon was tested, that's something where you got multiple, dozens potentially of activations per day that are observable events. So something like that could potentially have a shorter review period, whereas we have a few experiments ongoing right now with devices to mitigate wrong way driving, which thankfully is an extremely rare event to begin with, but as a result is very difficult to test for in a reaction. So those experiments probably have a period of something like 3 years to hopefully get enough data out of and enough observations to draw a meaningful conclusion. So I would say typically the minimum is about a year from install to completion, and it just depends on the individual device and the nature of the experiment.
Yeah, let me just add to what Dave said. The customary period when we give kind of a generic answer is some experiments are authorized for up to 3 years, and that's kind of the baseline we'd like to start out at. But as Dave said, if it's a relatively simple, it depends on the nature of the device. We don't typically like to say, well, minimum of 1 year, just because people might not realize that. Well, in a lot of cases, it's going to be a few more years than that.
Another question in the chat pod, it says, will any standards in the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, PROAG, be considered for inclusion in the next MUTCD, for example, pedestrian signals in multi-lane roundabouts?
I can maybe take a shot at that, and Dave, if you want to follow up, feel free. So we're in kind of an awkward position with PROAG not being fully adopted yet. Right now it's out there, but we don't know when a rulemaking is going to happen to adopt that, and we also don't know how the final format of that is going to turn out. So once something's adopted into regulation, the MUTCD will comply with that, just as we did with the ADAG. However, with PROAG, it's a little bit difficult to say or to predict how something is going to turn out in terms of required elements of it. So taking that is right now really a proposal and adopting it through rulemaking through another agency is it's a little bit difficult to accomplish it that way. So I'm giving a bit of a vague answer, but it's like I said, we're in kind of a difficult position on where the status of PROAG is.
That's all the questions in the chat pod for right now. So.
I don't know, Dave, Victoria, Kevin, did you guys have any questions for the division, or did we want to throw any questions out to the participants?
We can actually open the phone lines up for the participants if you'd like. It does get a little noisier when we do that, but if there aren't any other questions they want to put in the chat pod. Are you good with that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sure.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and work on unmuting everyone. And as I do that, please feel free to go ahead and start asking questions. But I'll caution you, if there's a party going on in the background where you are, please do us a favor and remute your phone line for us. Thanks.
Anyone have any questions for any of us here in Federal Highway? No? Okay. Then
I'm muting everybody. I have to unmute overall, and then I have to individually go through. So everyone who's called in on a phone line, I'm unmuting you right now. And then I'll be working through everybody else who is using their computer. So I'm almost through the 513 area code. So let me finish working my way through the rest of them. But if you area code starts with 513 or lower, or a bunch of the 614s are unmuted now, feel free to try asking a question if you'd like to. Okay, everybody who called in on the phone line is unmuted. We're going to go ahead and unmute everybody who's on their computer now. So Okay, we've unmuted everybody up through Dave Griffith in District 4. So
Okay.
if you're through there, you can go ahead and ask questions.
One of the 513 callers actually has a question.
Oh, hi 513.
The question's around an unsignalized intersection currently existing. However, there's a number of community members that would like to end up having a crosswalk installed at this unsignalized intersection. So everyone's requesting that a signal be installed. However, if you're looking at pedestrian warrants, they're not there right now today, but we know if they build it, they will come, or at least that's the anticipated thought. So what are your thoughts in regards to installing traffic control devices, in this particular case, a traffic signal that has no pedestrian counts that would warrant it, but you know that if you build it, they will come. So let's say a year from now, we do the pedestrian warrant count and it does actually meet it. What are your thoughts?
Sure,
Kevin?
I can take that if you guys want.
Oh, okay.
So the signal warrants are, while people do hew to them and they are provided for a very important reason, the signal warrants are guidance under the MUTCD. And what we define guidance as is, basically it is to be followed unless you have a strong documented engineering reason not to. And so in the case of the signal warrants, one of those things could very well be your knowledge and your engineering judgment that this is a location that the lack of a signal is preventing people from crossing, and once that will be installed, you will get that pedestrian demand. So if you have an engineering justification to install that signal based on the anticipated demand that you believe will be there, that's a valid reason to go ahead and install that signal. You just need to make sure you've documented that and you've done you've documented your reasons behind doing that. It is it's within your judgment to be able to install that signal. I do think it's important to go back and evaluate that once that has been complete and it's been given a period of time for traffic patterns, pedestrian traffic patterns as well to change, to acclimate, because you can get a lot of potentially negative side effects if you install a signal that isn't warranted, cut through traffic, things like that. So I do think it's important to go back and evaluate whether that judgment turned out to be accurate based on observations on the ground. But I would say that is a justifiable reason for installing a signal if it doesn't meet the requirements immediately. It's the same sort of thing as we do this regularly when we do traffic impact studies as well. We forecast vehicle traffic and install signals based on that as well. So, yeah, I do think that's a valid reason to do so as long as you justify your actions and as long as you follow up to make sure it's operating in a manner that's consistent with what you expected.
And on just adding to that, I think in terms of even though the warrants are guidance statements, the application of engineering judgment, it needs to be something a little more than kind of, well, we think this is going to happen, so we're going to do it. Your statement of we know if we build it, they'll come. There's obviously some logical basis in what you're saying, or it sounds like there's some intimate knowledge of what's going on out there, that there's a high enough demand for it, and maybe some generators nearby or something like that. But it has to be a kind of a legitimate basis to kind of make that decision. So and oftentimes it's good if you document that decision in case you get challenged later on.
Everybody is unmuted now, so if you'd like to ask questions, feel free. Well, you guys have done an excellent job as presenters because there's no more questions apparently. So, all right. Well, what we'll do now is go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you everyone for being on the webinar, and thank you so much to our presenters today. You've done a fabulous job, and we really appreciate your time and efforts on this very important topic for Ohio. So I will follow up with a link to the recording if it was successful, and also a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, as well as the contact information for the presenters. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks.